Hello and welcome to the 42nd session of the AI Safety ARCA reading group. And today we will talk about an article in Nature called Robotics, Ethics of Artificial Intelligence by Stuart Russell, Russ Altman and Manuela Velosa. Nature is probably the most prestigious international journal of science. And this is an article from 2 years ago where with a headline, 4 leading researchers share their concerns and solutions for reducing societal risks from intelligent machines. And of these, we're only reading 3 of the 4 because Sabine Howard, a lecturer in robotics, is not exactly talking about ethical problems, but more about solutions, in particular her startup robohub.org, and this is not super interesting for us. Much more interesting is the article by Stuart Russell, a professor of computer science from Berkeley, Russ Altman, professor of bioengineering and computer science from Stanford, Manuela Velosa, professor of computer science from Carnegie Mellon. Of course. Sorry, I forgot to share my screen. In a moment you should be able to see my screen. So I hope you see. Great. So we'll start with Stuart Russell, who talks about artificial weapons, in particular that we should take a stand on them. Because we, in this case, is the people working in artificial intelligence and robotics. We need to decide whether we want to support or oppose the development of lethal autonomous weapons system, abbreviated LAWS. So we're talking here about robots and other kinds of systems that choose who to engage, choose who to kill, really, without a human in the loop. This is something that Stuart Russell believes will be feasible reasonably soon, because all the elements that are required to have lethal autonomous weapon systems have been developed, but in isolation. So they just need to be combined, and of course building these things takes some time, but DARPA is working on it right now. The Defense Advanced Research Institute from the United States. And what it looks like, these lethal autonomous weapon systems, at least in the near future, they will probably have a form somewhat like armed quadcopters, like these drones you see from time to time, and not remotely piloted drones like the Predators. There are, of course, I think the legal system is probably reasonably clear in who has the blame if a lethal autonomous weapon system fails. Because if, say, the Danish military fields some lethal autonomous weapon system and this by accident kills someone, then I believe the Danish military will obviously be to blame from a legal point of view in much the same way as if they fired a gun or artillery and killed someone like that. It will be probably a lot of the things and problems with autonomous weapon systems will be reasonably close to the ones we are looking at right now. And right now there are a number of rules and laws of war. In particular, there is the Geneva Convention, which has, very roughly 4 parts. The first is that the military means that are used must be necessary. The second is there should be a discrimination between innocents and people who are actively fighting. And there should be some kind of proportionality. Even if there's one enemy in a village, it's not acceptable to annihilate the entire village, because that is not a proportional response, even though it kills one enemy if it kills too many innocents. The fourth is a principle of humanity, and somewhat more vague. And in particular, some of the obeying these international laws is hard. It's hard for humans, and we expect it to be much harder for AI, in particular in the beginning. Something like discriminating between competence and non-competence is something that will be really, really hard for AI to do right now. And Stuart Russell writes that if the international laws are not amended in some way to account for artificial intelligence, the alternative will inevitably be an arms race. A couple of times ago we had an article about arms races and got into more details about what is an arms race actually. And from that, I must say that to me it's not clear at all that we will have an arms race based on lethal autonomous weapon systems. It might be that the Americans make them and the Russians create something that is really good against drones, and then we don't have an arms race, at least not an arms race as defined in the previous articles. But this is probably a minor point. So the international status is, of course, that right now lethal autonomous weapon systems have not been banned, but a number of people in the UN are trying to ban them. In particular, Germany and Japan are against lethal autonomous weapon systems, and United States, United Kingdom, and Israel are for this. If it's banned, it will probably be to an extension of the Convention of Certain Conventional Weapons. That's a wonderful title, Convention on Conventional Weapons. But the argument that is used against lethal autonomous weapon systems is that the countries that are deploying them already have internal review processes to ensure compliance with international law. At least that is how Stuart Russell frames their argument. I'm not sure it's exactly a good summary, because saying if some people are arguing that we should change the law, then saying, oh, we shouldn't do that because we are already compliant with the law, it's kind of a non sequitur. It doesn't follow in any meaningful way. There is, on the broad strokes, however, an international consensus that there should at least be meaningful human control with these kind of autonomous weapons. But unfortunately, the word meaningful is undefined and not meaningful. So this means that it's something vague that are not restricting anybody from doing anything in practice. There are more arguments for or against these kind of weapon systems. One is that if AI turns out to be really effective, they might also be more selective. And if they are more selective than humans, they might minimize civilian casualties. Like if we go back to the Geneva Conventions, if the discrimination of competence and non-competence can be done better by an artificial intelligence than by a human, then it might be more ethical to have lethal autonomous weapon systems. I would like to make a point here that this is something that has been argued very much about remote weapons, and not autonomous but remote weapons. Here, for instance, in particular, the American Predator drone program, which has killed a lot of people, and where people argued because this weapon allows people to take decisions while they're sitting in an air-conditioned room 1,000 kilometers away, and not in the heat of the moment, they will make better decisions and there will be less collateral damage. This is something that is very contentious. Pakistan claims that 50 civilians are killed for every militant, while so like a huge amount of collateral damage. The United States claim that there has never been any collateral damage at all, which is also a very fantastical claim. I would probably guess the truth is somewhere in between. So that is one argument that also needs to be considered. There are more, because if lethal autonomous weapons systems turned out to be really effective, they might lower the threshold for going to war, which just like air power made it more the American and the European Union were more active in Libya because they could use air power instead of having boots on the ground. And this kind of threshold theory is really important for when countries go to war. Another problem with autonomous robots is that if terrorists get a hold on them, it might be something that is very easy for terrorists to repurpose to attack civilians, and that might be really bad. It might also be something that peacetime policing functions could suddenly start to use a lot if it's developed very much by the military. And the last is one I have a bit of a problem. I'm an avowed utilitarian consequentialist, but many people are not, and some of the people who are not say that lethal autonomous weapons violate a fundamental principle of human dignity because the machines choose who to kill. And this is a problem to many people, and I of course respect that. I'm not exactly sure I can easily see at least why it's so important who decides to kill civilians. I think the more important is to avoid civilians are killed. But this is something that many people care deeply about. Stuart Russell's last point, or maybe second last, is that we should consider the end point of the trajectory, meaning that we should consider a world where drones have been developed fully, where the artificial intelligence is a solved problem, where the weapon systems are limited by physics and not by the capabilities of the artificial intelligence. In this case, it looks like we are going to have very tiny flying robots, extremely maneuverable and thus very hard to target, that carry just a 1 gram shaped charge that is enough to kill just one human, but deployed in millions. And this kind of thing would obviously be very hard for humans to defend against, and this is not a desirable future. So, that is, of course, the people who develop this will say, yeah, we will have these tiny flying robots and they will only carry 1 gram shaped charges, but they will be able to distinguish between competence and non-competence, and maybe even important competence and not important competence, and only target the leaders, for instance. And this might be true, but it's also something where unprepared humans, at least, are utterly defenseless. And that sounds like Stuart Russell strongly believes this is not a desirable future. And I probably think that's probably a reasonable common position, though not self-evident. But you're right, of course, that in theory it could be used only for good. It could be used to target exclusively the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda leaders, and then it would only have good effects if it's used only like that. But this is something that we need to make decisions on. We need the people who are working with artificial intelligence and robotics need to take a position, think about this, maybe organize debates and study the arguments, write positional papers, and vote, of course, also in their respective organizations and maybe in their governments. Because if we don't do anything, then that's a vote to continue, develop, and deploy these weapons. So that is Stuart Russell's hope, of course, that people will take actions against this. I don't have a good view of the political structure. My intuition is that there's not going to be a ban on lethal autonomous weapon systems, at least as it looks now. But this is not something that I really know a lot about. So action is definitely needed if you believe that this endpoint is a really bad endpoint. Moving on from Stuart Russell, To just briefly, Sabine Howard, why I chose to not include her. She has made this RoboHub about how to shape the debate on artificial intelligence and how to ensure that different actors that are working with artificial intelligence have some kind of coordination and unity of message and things like that. And that might be a good thing and might be a bad thing depending on whether you agree with them or disagree with them. But it's not something that has a lot of ethical significance. Russ Altman, however, he starts his article by having 3 paragraphs of just listing all the wonderful things we could do with artificial intelligence. And this is not really an ethical statement, because all these wonderful things AI could do are just good. So that's not really an interesting ethical article. But he does have 2 ethical concerns. One is that there will be a greater difference between the health care that people in the rich world receive and people in the poor world receive, and rich people and poor people. And he strongly believes that if there is a 2-tiered system where rich people can benefit from powerful medical algorithms and poor people cannot, that would be unjust and unfair. And he believes to avoid this is the responsibility of both the government. That is the responsibility of the government is probably reasonably uncontroversial. But in particular, it's also the responsibility of the AI researchers to ensure that the AI technologies are distributed equally. So this is one of his concerns. The other concern is that the results of artificial intelligence can be really hard to both understand and explain. If you have something like Bayesian models, you can to an extent understand it and you can explain it. But deep learning and neural networks are notoriously difficult to understand and explain. And that would be kind of difficult if you have a patient and the algorithms say you should operate on him and you can't explain to the patient why you should operate on him. That sounds quite ethically problematic. The last part is Manuela Velosa, who says we should embrace a robot-human world, because robots as they are now and humans are different in that humans have much better perceptions, much better cognitive ability, and much more better actuation. We can do much more things with our hands than robots can do. And she believes this may always be the case. This is exactly the opposite of Stuart Russell, who believes that the ethical point was to look at the end point of the trajectory. And this causes her to believe that robots will complement humans, not supplant them. And here the problem is to enable the robot to ask for help if it doesn't understand the situation, if it's in doubt about something or it can't do a particular thing it would like to do. And to figure out how... Do you have a question? This is a good question in the article. Manuela Velosa does not give any supporting argument for. She just writes, "This may always be the case," without anything, any supporting things. I think I would expect when Manuela Velosa says "always," she doesn't actually mean always, but has just a more narrow horizon, so she says this may always be the case. But she's actually meaning within the next 20 years or something. Possibly because if we are trying to influence ethical matters, then we might be able to influence what happens within the next 20 years, and we cannot really influence what happens more than 20 years in the future. So for all practical purposes, always might be correct. This is completely my guess about what Manuela Velosa believes. I don't really have... I haven't read anything else she's written apart from this very short article. But that's basically all I have. So thank you for watching, and see you again in 1 week.